If Alberta were to leave Canada, it would deal a massive economic shock to the country, one of the biggest in its modern history. Alberta is a critical engine of the Canadian economy, and its departure would ripple through federal finances, provincial economies, trade, labor markets, and national identity. Here's a breakdown of what could happen. Immediate economic impacts. Canada's GDP would shrink significantly. Alberta contributes about 17% of Canada's GDP, despite having only about 10% of the population. Canada's GDP would immediately drop by over 400 billion Canadian dollars. That's more than the GDP of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, PEI, all combined, times 5. Canada would fall in global economic rankings. It could even drop out of the G7 and possibly even the top 10 global economies. There would be a loss of Alberta's oil and gas revenue. Alberta is the energy heart of Canada and produces about 80% of Canadian oil and 2/3 of its natural gas. Much of this is exported, primarily to the United States. Without Alberta, Canada becomes a net importer of fossil fuels. It would depend on the United States for fuel and natural gas. Energy prices may rise, especially in provinces like Ontario and Quebec, by over 40 to 50%. Ottawa would lose billions in federal tax revenue from energy companies and workers. Alberta's oil sands alone represents hundreds of billions in current and future economic value. There would be a massive blow to federal revenues. Alberta is historically a have province, meaning it pays more into federal equalization and revenue systems than it receives. If we look back to 2023, Alberta taxpayers contributed more than $20 billion more than they received in federal spending. Ottawa would lose a net fiscal contributor, forcing budget cuts or tax hikes in the rest of Canada. The equalization might even collapse. Provinces like Quebec, Manitoba, and the Maritimes rely heavily on equalization payments. Without Alberta's contribution, the system may become unstable, triggering economic crises in these smaller provinces. There would be financial market shock. Canadian dollars would likely fall. Investors would downgrade the Canadian dollar over lost GDP, resources, and investor confidence. This means it would lead to higher import prices, more expensive goods, increased inflation, higher interest rates to stabilize this currency downgrade. There would also be a credit downgrade. Canada's sovereign credit rating could be downgraded due to smaller tax base, energy instability, lower GDP, political uncertainty, and the cost to borrow would rise significantly for federal governments and provinces. There would also be structural disruptions. There would be trade disruptions. Alberta exports billions in goods and services to the rest of Canada. Most of it is oil, natural gas, beef and agriculture, and manufactured goods. If Alberta becomes a foreign country or even a US state, tariffs and border controls would apply. Interprovincial trade becomes international trade. Supply chains could face delays and reorganization. There might also be a brain drain or a labor shock. Alberta attracts skilled workers with high wages and low taxes. If it succeeds, outmigration from other provinces could accelerate. Professionals may locate or relocate to Alberta for these opportunities. Western Canada, BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba could face a regional identity crisis and labor rebalancing. There would also be social and infrastructural impacts. There would be a strain on the healthcare system. Alberta helps fund Canada's public healthcare system. Its departure means less federal money for hospitals, doctor salaries, and pharmaceuticals. This may force other provinces to rethink healthcare financing, possibly introducing more privatization. There would be long-term systemic consequences. There would be political fragmentation, first of all. Western alienation could grow. Saskatchewan or even BC might reevaluate their place in Canada. This could lead to a domino effect. A rise in Quebec sovereignty, collapse of federal cohesion, restructuring of the Constitution, or even full national reorganization. There would definitely be a national identity crisis. Canada's global image is partly built on unity despite diversity, vast resource wealth, and strong social programs. But losing Alberta could feel like losing a founding piece of that confederation, undermining national confidence and diplomacy. The likelihood of other provinces joining Alberta and leaving Canada is low in the short term, but not impossible. And it increases significantly if Alberta's exit is seen as successful, economic or political. Here's a deep dive into the possibility of a domino effect, province by province. Let's start off in the western provinces. Saskatchewan is most likely to follow. Ideologically aligned with Alberta, conservative, resource-based, anti-Ottawa sentiment is strong. It also has a strong history of prairie populism and shared grievances over equalization payments, carbon taxes, federal agriculture and environmental regulations. And if Alberta left and prospered, Saskatchewan might seriously consider a referendum, especially under a premier with a populist mandate. The likelihood of joining Alberta is actually about medium to high. It's about 50 to 70% over time, depending on Alberta's outcome. Now let's take a look at Manitoba. It's less likely, but we want to watch this province closely. It's more politically moderate and more integrated with Ontario economically and culturally, but still has rural Western elements that could be influenced by prairie solidarity. We would likely feel pressure from both sides, West and East loyalty. Now, the likelihood of them joining Alberta and leaving Canada is about 20 to 30%. They might lean towards federal reform over separation. Now let's take a look at British Columbia. It's unlikely, but it could be very complex. Economically, it's powerful, globally connected with Pacific trade ports. Culturally progressive, especially in Vancouver, could lead to a more than less likely scenario. It has its own regional identity and history of isolation sentiments, especially when we consider the Cascadia movement. Interior BC is more conservative and pro-resource and is aligned with Alberta. This might push for a regional autonomy or even exploring a Cascadia bloc with Washington and Oregon if federal breakdown worsens. The likelihood of them leaving, if Alberta does leave, is pretty low. It's about 10 to 20%. But it's more likely to go its own way or push for decentralization. Now, we often hear about Quebec wanting to leave Canada. It has the strongest succession movement in Canadian history. It held two referendums, 1980 and 1995, with the second coming very close to winning, actually 1.2% away. Alberta leaving could embolden the Bloc Québécois or the Parti Québécois, arguing if Alberta can leave, so can we. Quebec wouldn't join Alberta, of course, but it might try to go solo. Now, if Alberta does go solo, the support for sovereignty in the short term for Quebec would likely jump 30 to 40%. Now, Atlantic Canada is vulnerable, but it's pretty loyal to Canada. It's highly dependent on equalization payments, which Alberta helps fund. Economically, it's fragile, and demographically, it's aging. It may feel abandoned if Alberta and possibly Saskatchewan leave. It's got strong Federalist sentiment and deep Canadian identity. It would more likely push for a strong federation or protection than leaving. The likelihood of them leaving Canada, if Alberta does leave, is very low. It's about 5 to 10%, unless Confederation unravels this dramatically. Now, if we look at the core of Canada, Ontario, the political and economic heart of Canada, really, it's deeply Federalist. Most Canadian institutions, finance, and governance are centered here. Ontario might lead efforts to stabilize or reform the Federation in response to Alberta's departure. The likelihood of them leaving Canada is probably 0%. Unless, of course, Canada just ceases to function as a country altogether. The Northern Territories would probably follow Ottawa. Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut are highly dependent on federal support. They would not align culturally, economically, or geographically with Alberta, and they would stay with whatever remains of Canada or possibly gain a little bit more autonomy. The chance of them following Alberta towards independence is probably 0. Now, there's also the Cascade scenario. If Alberta's departure destabilizes the Federation, we could see Saskatchewan joining Alberta as part of a new West state or nation. Quebec holds a third referendum. Atlantic Canada considers autonomous arrangements or tighter US integration for economic survival. Western BC flirts with a Cascadia independence. That means maybe joining some states along the western coast. Canada dissolves into regional blocks, not all joining Alberta, but all reconsidering what Confederation actually means. What do you think would happen if Alberta leaves Canada? What would happen to Canada and the provinces and Confederation as a whole? We would love to hear from you. Leave your comment in the comment section below.